My father's face went completely white. Not pale like he was surprised. White like someone had just pulled the floor out from under him. The venue manager was still standing there, smiling politely. "Ms. Emma," he said again, a little louder this time, like he was worried I hadn't heard him. "Everything is ready for you." And behind him, my parents were staring at me like they had never seen me before. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because if you had walked past the building 5 minutes earlier, you would have seen something very different. You would have seen a girl in a blue dress sitting on a folding chair outside a wedding venue. Waiting. Quiet. Like she had nowhere else to be. There was also a text message on my phone that morning. Just one line from the venue manager. "Everything is set exactly the way you requested." At the time, I didn't think much about it. Actually, that's not entirely true. I noticed it. I just didn't respond. Anyway, hi. I'm Emma. And I didn't think I'd ever say this story out loud. Mostly because for a long time, I wasn't even sure if I understood what had actually happened. Or maybe I did understand, and I just didn't want to admit it. You know when something feels wrong for years, but you keep explaining it away because the alternative is too uncomfortable? That was my family. I'm 23 now. At the time of the wedding, I was 22. My sister Lily was 26, which in our family meant she had already achieved the most important milestone, being the favorite. I don't say that bitterly. At least, I try not to. It was just the way things were. Lily was the bright one. The one who made my parents proud. The one who got framed photos on the mantle and long Facebook captions on her birthday. I was the other one. Not ignored exactly. That would have been easier to explain. More like quietly placed slightly off to the side. Like when you set an extra chair at a table but nobody ever sits in it. Growing up, I told myself it didn't bother me. And for the most part, I think I believed that. I was the independent one. The quiet one. The kid who figured things out on her own. Which sounds nice when you say it like that. But what it really meant was that by the time I was 16, I had already stopped expecting my parents to notice things about me. Actually, wait. That might have been the first sign. Not the wedding. Not the chair outside the venue. Something earlier. Because when Lily got engaged, my mom called me. Not to tell me the news. To ask if I could help organize part of the reception. I remember standing in my apartment kitchen, holding the phone between my shoulder and ear while I rinsed a coffee mug. Mom said, very casually, "You're good with logistics, right? Maybe you could help with some of the vendor stuff." And I said yes. Of course I did. Because when someone finally asks you to be part of something, even in a small way, you don't stop to question it. Looking back now, that conversation mattered more than I realized. But at the time it just felt like a normal phone call. Over the next few months I ended up handling a bunch of little things for the wedding. Vendor emails. Scheduling questions. Confirming deliveries. Nothing glamorous. Mostly boring administrative stuff that Lily didn't want to deal with. But I didn't mind. Actually, I liked it. It made me feel useful. Like maybe this time I was part of the family project instead of just someone watching it happen. There was one thing I kept coming back to, though. One small detail about the venue. I didn't mention it to anyone at first because it seemed irrelevant. And honestly, I assumed I was misunderstanding something. But later I realized it wasn't the first time something like that had happened. And weirdly, that part wasn't even what hurt the most. The venue itself was beautiful. Old brick building downtown, big windows, string lights in the courtyard. The kind of place people post on Instagram with captions like "perfect night." Lily fell in love with it immediately. And my parents were thrilled because it looked expensive enough to impress everyone. The manager there, Daniel, was the one I emailed most often while helping with the planning. He was professional, friendly, very organized. But sometimes when he replied to my messages, he would phrase things strangely. Not wrong exactly. Just slightly off. Like he assumed I had a different role in the wedding than I actually did. I almost corrected him once. Then I didn't. Because it didn't seem important. And honestly, I was used to letting little misunderstandings slide. Which is probably why, on the morning of my sister's wedding, when that text message popped up, everything is set exactly the way you requested. I just stared at it for a few seconds and locked my phone. At the time, I thought the confusing part of the day would be that message. I had no idea the real confusion would start later. Outside the building, with a folding chair, and my parents telling me I wasn't on the guest list. But the strangest part? When I sat down out there, I didn't even argue. And sometimes I still wonder why. Actually, no, that's not true. I know exactly why. Because moments like that had been happening my entire life. And I had gotten very good at pretending they were normal. The first time my parents mentioned the venue, it was during Sunday dinner. Not a big family gathering or anything formal. Just the four of us around the table like we'd done for years. My mom serving pasta, my dad talking about traffic like it had personally offended him, and Lily scrolling through photos of centerpieces on her phone. I remember Lily suddenly turning the screen toward us. "Look," she said. "This is the courtyard at the venue." String lights hung across the brick walls in perfect lines. There were long wooden tables and white chairs and those tiny glass candle holders that always look prettier in photos than they do in real life. My mom actually gasped a little. "Oh, Lily, that's beautiful." My dad leaned over to look closer. "That's classy." Then they started talking about the guest list. Who should sit where? Whether Uncle Rob would complain about the music. Normal wedding stuff. And I just sat there, eating pasta, nodding along. Nobody asked my opinion about the venue. That part didn't surprise me. But a few minutes later Lily suddenly looked at me and said, "Actually, Emma's been helping with emails." My mom nodded like she had just remembered something. "Oh right. The vendor stuff." It wasn't dismissive exactly. Just quick. Like checking something off a list. Still, I felt this little spark in my chest because at least I had a role. So over the next couple of months I kept helping with the logistics. Emails mostly. Sometimes phone calls. The venue manager, Daniel, would reply almost immediately whenever I reached out. "Hi Emma." His emails always started. Friendly. Direct. Efficient. At first I thought he assumed I was Lily's assistant or maybe a wedding planner. Which honestly made sense. I never corrected him because it saved time. But then one of his messages ended with something strange. "Let me know if you'd like any changes to the layout before final approval." Final approval. I remember staring at those words for a second. Because technically that decision belonged to Lily and my parents. Not me. So I forwarded the email to Lily with a quick message, Daniel asking about layout approval. She replied with a thumbs up emoji and, "Whatever you think works." That happened more than once. Questions about table arrangements, lighting, music setup. Each time I forwarded them. Each time Lily basically said the same thing. "Up to you." Which sounds like trust when you say it out loud. But I'm not sure that's what it was. Looking back now, I think it was more like disinterest. She didn't want to deal with details. And I was there. So the decisions quietly drifted toward me. But again, that didn't feel strange at the time. It felt like helping. And if I'm being honest, part of me liked being involved. It made me feel needed. There's something about growing up as the low-maintenance kid that sticks with you. You learn not to ask for attention. But if someone offers you responsibility, you grab it. Even if it's small. Even if nobody really notices. Actually, this next part might sound familiar to some people. And I sometimes wonder if I was the only one who just accepted it for so long. You know that moment when your family assigns you a role without ever saying it out loud? Lily was the star. My parents were the proud producers, and I was the quiet stagehand making sure the lights worked. No one ever explained that system, but everyone seemed to understand it. So when my mom called one evening and asked if I could handle communication with the venue for a bit, I didn't hesitate. Of course, I said. She sounded relieved. Oh good. Lily's just overwhelmed right now. Overwhelmed. Which? I guess weddings do that to people. But something about the tone stuck with me. Not enough to question it. Just enough to notice. Daniel and I started exchanging emails almost daily after that. Schedules. Delivery windows. Parking arrangements. At one point he even sent over the venue contract again to confirm a few details. I skimmed through it quickly. Mostly dates and numbers. Standard stuff. But there was one line near the bottom that caught my attention. It listed the primary contact for the event. And next to it was my name. I remember blinking at the screen. Because that couldn't be right. I almost emailed Daniel immediately to correct it. Then I stopped. Because technically, I was the person communicating with him. And changing it would probably just create more paperwork. So I left it alone. I told myself it was just a logistical shortcut. Nothing important. But that little detail kept sitting in the back of my mind. Like a loose thread on a sweater you keep noticing but never pull. And here's the strange thing. Even months later, when the wedding week finally arrived, that thread was still there. Because Daniel never stopped addressing things to me. Not once. Every confirmation. Every update. Every adjustment. Always the same greeting. Hi, Emma. At the time I assumed it was just habit. Now I realize that assumption was doing a lot of work for me. Because the alternative explanation would have required asking questions. And I had spent most of my life avoiding those. By the time the wedding day finally came, everything seemed perfectly normal. My parents were excited. Lily was glowing. The venue was fully booked for the evening. And that morning, right after I woke up, my phone buzzed with a text. From Daniel. Just one sentence. Everything is set exactly the way you requested. I remember staring at the message, thinking maybe it was meant for someone else. Or maybe it referred to one of the minor layout suggestions I'd forwarded weeks earlier. Either way, it didn't seem urgent. So I locked my phone and continued getting ready. But what I didn't know then was that the text wasn't a mistake. Daniel wasn't confused. And the role he thought I had in that wedding was very different from the one my parents had planned for me. I just wouldn't realize that until I arrived at the venue, and my dad pointed toward a folding chair outside the building. I remember the drive to the venue being strangely quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind where your brain keeps circling the same small thought over and over, like it's trying to decide if something matters. That text from Daniel kept floating back into my head. Everything is set exactly the way you requested. I tried to replay every conversation we'd had about the setup. Maybe I had suggested something about the table layout, or the lighting in the courtyard. But nothing I could think of felt important enough to deserve that sentence. Still, I told myself it probably wasn't a big deal. Weddings are chaotic. People mix up messages all the time. And honestly, I had spent most of the last few months quietly handling vendor emails. It wasn't impossible that Daniel just assumed certain decisions had come from me. So I let it go. By the time I reached downtown, the streets were already getting busy with Saturday traffic. I parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the way to the venue. The building looked even nicer in person. Old brick walls. Tall glass doors. Those string lights Lily loved already glowing softly even though the sun hadn't fully set yet. For a moment, I just stood there, watching people arrive. Guests in suits and dresses walking through the front entrance. Laughter drifting out from the courtyard. Everything looked exactly like those Instagram photos Lily had shown us. Perfect. I checked my phone again. Still no follow-up from Daniel. Which was oddly comforting, because it meant the text probably wasn't important after all. That was my first false reassurance moment, I think. The little voice in my head saying, "See? Nothing weird is happening." And I believed it. At least for the next 30 seconds. Because the second I stepped toward the entrance, my mom spotted me. She was standing near the door with a clipboard and that tight expression she always gets when she's hosting something. "Emma," she said quickly. "Not warm. Not cold either. Just efficient. Can you wait outside for a moment?" I blinked. Wait outside. She glanced over her shoulder toward the courtyard where guests were gathering. "We're finishing seating arrangements." That sounded reasonable enough. Weddings are chaotic. So I nodded. Sure. But then my dad walked over. And the moment shifted. He looked at me for about half a second before saying something that didn't quite land in my brain right away. "You're not on the guest list." I actually laughed a little at first. Because obviously that was a joke. Right? But neither of them laughed. My mom shifted her weight awkwardly. "We had to limit numbers," she said quickly. Dad pointed toward a folding chair placed near the side wall of the building. "You can wait there." Wait. Those words took a second to connect. "You mean, until the ceremony starts?" Mom avoided eye contact. "Just wait there for now." And that's the part that still confuses me. Because logically, I should have argued. I should have said something like, "I helped plan half this wedding." Or, "I'm literally your daughter." But instead, I walked over to the chair and sat down. I wish I could explain that reaction better. Part of it was shock. But honestly, part of it was habit. When something uncomfortable happens often enough in your life, you stop challenging it immediately. You pause first. You try to interpret it. You look for the version of the situation that makes everyone else reasonable. So I told myself maybe they were stressed. Maybe there had been a seating mistake. Maybe someone would come get me in a minute. That's what I told myself. Guests kept walking past. Some of them glanced at me politely. Most didn't notice me at all. From where I was sitting, I could see through the courtyard doors. The reception tables were already arranged inside. And something about the layout made my stomach tighten. Because I recognized it. Not in a vague way. In a specific way. Those tables were arranged exactly like a diagram I had sent Daniel weeks earlier. At the time Lily had said, "Whatever you think works." So I had sketched a quick suggestion and emailed it over. I hadn't thought about it again after that. But now I was staring at it in real life. And the thought slipped into my head before I could stop it. Why would he text me about that this morning? I shook it off. It still didn't make sense. Inside the courtyard, music started playing softly. People were finding their seats. Everything looked normal. For a moment I almost convinced myself I was overthinking the situation. Maybe my parents really did just need a minute to sort out seating. Maybe someone would walk out soon and say, "Emma, come on in." But then I noticed something else. Near the entrance doors, Daniel, the venue manager. He was speaking with one of the staff members and holding a clipboard. And every few seconds he glanced toward the courtyard. Like he was checking something. Or someone. I remember thinking briefly about walking over and saying hello. After all, we'd been emailing for months. But something held me back. Maybe pride. Maybe embarrassment. Or maybe I just didn't want to risk creating another awkward moment. So I stayed in the chair, watching the doors, waiting. And that's when Daniel finally stepped outside. He scanned the courtyard quickly, then turned his head, and saw me sitting there. His expression changed immediately. Confusion first, then recognition. And as he walked straight toward me, one strange thought crossed my mind. Why does he look like I'm the person he's been looking for? Daniel slowed down as he approached me. Not in a hesitant way. More like someone who had just found the person they were expecting and was adjusting his pace so he wouldn't look rushed. I remember sitting up slightly in the chair, suddenly aware of how strange the whole situation must look from his perspective. A guest, sitting alone outside the venue, in a formal dress, while everyone else was already inside. "Emma," he said. The way he said my name felt normal, friendly, like it always did in his emails. "Hi," I replied, giving a small awkward wave. For a second we just looked at each other. Then his eyebrows pulled together. "Why are you out here?" It was such a simple question, and suddenly I felt ridiculous trying to answer it. "My parents asked me to wait," I said. Daniel glanced toward the courtyard doors. "Wait." I nodded. "They said I'm not on the guest list." The silence that followed lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it stretched long enough for me to notice something in Daniel's face shift. Not confusion. Not exactly. More like recalculating. He looked back at me, then at the entrance, then back at me again. "Oh," he said quietly, and for a brief moment I thought maybe this was where everything would resolve itself. Maybe he would say something simple like, "Let me check with them." Or, "There must be a misunderstanding." That's what I expected. Instead, Daniel straightened slightly and gave a polite professional smile. "Well," he said, "that's definitely not correct." My stomach tightened. "Not correct." He shook his head. "No." Then he said the sentence that would eventually replay in my head 100 times. "Ms. Emma, everything is ready for you." At first I honestly thought I had misheard him. "Sorry, what?" He gestured toward the courtyard behind him. "The layout you approved is exactly how you requested. The lighting adjustments were finished an hour ago." I stared at him, because those words didn't fit the situation at all. "The layout I approved." Daniel blinked. "Yes." I shook my head slowly. "No, I think you're mixing me up with Emma." The voice behind Daniel cut through the air sharply. "My dad." He had stepped outside without me noticing, and his expression was strange. Not angry. Not exactly. But tense. Daniel turned politely. "Oh, good evening. I was just speaking with Ms. Emma about." "That's not necessary," my dad interrupted quickly. Daniel paused. "I'm sorry." My dad gestured vaguely toward the courtyard. "The event is already underway." "Yes," Daniel said carefully. "But I was just confirming details with Ms. Emma since she—" Dad's voice hardened slightly. "She's not part of the guest list." There was a moment of stillness. Daniel looked from my father to me, and something subtle happened in his expression again, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. "Oh," he said slowly. I felt heat creeping up my neck, because suddenly the conversation felt wrong. Like two people discussing two completely different versions of reality. Daniel adjusted his grip on the clipboard. "Well," he said politely, "according to our records, Emma is the primary contact for this reservation." The words hung there. Primary contact. My father didn't react immediately, which is how I knew he didn't understand what Daniel meant yet. "That's just administrative," Dad said dismissively. "Her sister is the bride." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, of course." But he didn't look convinced. And that's when something else clicked into place inside my head. Because I remembered the contract email from months earlier. The one listing the primary contact. The one with my name. At the time it hadn't felt important. Just paperwork. But now I was sitting outside the venue, being told I wasn't invited, while the venue manager was speaking to me like I had authority over the entire event. Two realities, side by side, and neither one fully made sense yet. I felt suddenly exhausted. Daniel, I said quietly, it's fine. Really? He looked at me. You're sure? I nodded. My parents are probably just sorting something out. It felt like the easiest explanation, the most comfortable one. And for a moment Daniel seemed to consider pushing further. But then he gave a polite nod. All right. He turned slightly toward my father. If you need anything regarding the setup, please let me know. Dad gave a tight smile. Everything looks fine. Daniel hesitated another second, then walked back inside. The courtyard doors closed behind him, and suddenly it was just me and my dad standing outside the building. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then Dad exhaled slowly and rubbed the bridge of his nose. You didn't need to talk to him. I wasn't trying to, I said. He came over. Dad looked toward the courtyard again, like he was checking whether anyone had noticed the conversation. You can go home if you want, he said. The words landed quietly, but they hit harder than anything else that evening. Go home. Not wait. Not come back later. Just leave. I swallowed. Right. Dad nodded once, like the decision had already been made. Then he went back inside, and the doors closed again. I sat down on the folding chair. For the first time since arriving, the noise from the reception started to feel distant, muffled, like it was happening somewhere far away. I stared down at my phone, and that's when the earlier text message from Daniel caught my eye again. Everything is set exactly the way you requested. The sentence suddenly looked different. He hadn't said Lily requested. He hadn't said your family requested. He had said you. And a strange thought slowly began forming in the back of my mind. One I didn't want to examine too closely yet. Because if it was true, then this entire situation wasn't just awkward. It was something else entirely. Something much bigger. But before I keep going, I need to stop here for a second. Because there's a piece of context I didn't explain earlier. And without it, everything that happened next will sound like a coincidence. It wasn't. The truth is, I had already been inside that venue earlier that morning, hours before the wedding started. And at the time, my parents had no idea I was there. So, before I keep telling you what happened outside the venue, I need to rewind a few hours. Because the truth is, that wasn't my first time at the building that day. I had been there that morning, early, before the chairs were set up, before the flowers arrived, before Lily even started getting ready. Daniel had asked if I could stop by to take a quick look at the final setup. At the time, that request didn't seem strange. After months of emails back and forth, it felt normal that he would want to confirm everything before the event started. So I drove downtown around 8 that morning. The street was quiet. The venue doors were open, and a few staff members were already moving tables around inside the courtyard. Daniel greeted me like we'd known each other for years. Morning, Emma, he said. Perfect timing. Then he walked me through the space. The tables. The lighting adjustments. The layout diagram I had emailed weeks earlier. Everything looked exactly like the plan. At one point he even asked, do you want the head table moved 2 feet closer to the courtyard arch? I remember blinking. Sure, I said. And he nodded immediately and told one of the staff members to adjust it. At the time I assumed he was just being thorough. Looking back now, that assumption sounds almost embarrassingly naive. Because the entire conversation was happening like I was the person in charge. Not Lily. Not my parents. Me. I didn't question it. Honestly, I think part of me just slipped into the role. You know when someone treats you like the responsible one long enough that you stop correcting them? That's what it felt like. Before I left, Daniel handed me a clipboard. Just sign the final confirmation here, he said. I hesitated for half a second. Isn't Lily supposed to? You're listed as the primary contact, he said casually. Right. The contract line again. So I signed it. Then I went home to get ready for the wedding. And that should have been the moment when I realized something important. But I didn't. Because when you grow up being the quiet helper in your family, you get used to doing things behind the scenes. You don't stop and ask why. You just keep things moving. Which brings me back to that folding chair outside the venue. Sitting there after my dad told me to go home. Looking at that text message again. Everything is set exactly the way you requested. And suddenly realizing that Daniel hadn't been mistaken. He had been talking to me all along. Because according to the venue, I was the person responsible for the event. And that's when something else surfaced in my memory. A conversation from 2 years earlier. A completely unrelated one. Or at least, that's what I thought at the time. Back then, I had just finished selling the small software company I helped build in college. Nothing massive. Not tech billionaire level or anything like that. But enough that I suddenly had more money than I had ever expected at 21. Most of it went into savings and boring investments. Except for one thing. A property purchase. The brick building downtown that housed the venue. At the time it wasn't even operating as an event space yet. The previous owner had listed it quietly. I bought it through a holding company on the advice of a financial advisor. Just a long-term investment. The management team stayed the same. Daniel included. Which meant, technically, I owned the building where my sister was getting married. But here's the strange part. I never told my family. Not because I was hiding it intentionally. It just never came up. And honestly, I had gotten used to my achievements being background noise in my family. So I didn't make a big announcement. Life moved on. The venue eventually opened as an event space. Daniel managed bookings. And when my parents started planning Lily's wedding months later, they found the venue online. Booked it. Signed the contract. Through Daniel. None of them ever realized the owner listed in the management documents was connected to me. And I never corrected that assumption. Which leads to the part of this story that I still think about sometimes. The moment sitting on that folding chair. When I realized I had a choice. I could stand up. Walk inside. And clarify everything immediately. Or I could stay where I was. Let the evening play out. Let the truth reveal itself naturally. And here's where things get complicated. Because I still don't know if the decision I made next was the right one. That's something I genuinely wonder about. Part of me thinks I should have stopped the situation right there. Saved everyone the embarrassment. But another part of me, the part that had spent 22 years quietly accepting small dismissals, wanted to see what would happen next. Wanted to understand how far this moment would go if I didn't interrupt it. So I stayed in the chair. For another minute. Then another. Until the courtyard doors opened again. And Daniel stepped back outside. Except this time. He wasn't looking confused. He was looking certain. And the first words out of his mouth were loud enough that several guests near the entrance turned their heads. "Ms. Emma," he said, "your event is ready." When Daniel said it the second time, it wasn't quiet. "Ms. Emma, your event is ready." A few guests near the entrance turned their heads. Not dramatically. Just that natural curious glance people give when someone important seems to arrive. And suddenly the folding chair felt very small. Daniel stepped slightly to the side and gestured toward the courtyard doors. The motion was simple. Professional. But the implication landed like a dropped glass. Inside the venue, the music slowed. People were taking their seats. My dad was still standing near the entrance. My mom had appeared beside him now, holding the edge of her clipboard like she was trying to remember what it was for. Both of them were looking at Daniel. Then at me. Then back at Daniel. The confusion on their faces was almost painful to watch. "Daniel," my dad said carefully, "there seems to be a misunderstanding." Daniel didn't look defensive. Just calm. What part, sir? The event belongs to my daughter, Dad said, gesturing toward the courtyard where Lily was somewhere inside getting ready. Daniel nodded politely. Yes. Lily's wedding reception. Right, Dad said quickly. So Emma doesn't need to be involved in. Emma signed the final confirmation this morning. The sentence dropped between them. Not aggressive, just factual. My mom's eyebrows pulled together. Signed what? Daniel lifted the clipboard slightly. The event authorization. Standard procedure. My dad laughed once. That tight, uncomfortable laugh people do when they're sure something ridiculous is happening. That's just paperwork. Daniel didn't argue. But he also didn't agree. Well, he said gently, the person listed as primary contact is responsible for final approval. Another pause. I could see my mom thinking, trying to piece together the logistics of something she didn't fully understand. Then her eyes moved slowly toward me. Emma, she said carefully, why would you sign anything? That question hung there for a second, and I realized something strange. For the first time that day, everyone was actually looking at me. Not past me, not around me, at me. I stood up from the folding chair. My legs felt steadier than I expected. I thought it was just confirming the layout, I said honestly. Daniel nodded. It was. My dad rubbed his forehead. This is ridiculous. But I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice now, because the conversation wasn't following the simple direction he expected. And that's when something almost went wrong. For about 30 seconds, it looked like the entire situation might collapse into awkward explanation. My dad turned toward me again. Emma, just tell him Lily is the one paying for the venue. That sentence landed harder than he intended. Because, technically, that wasn't true. But Daniel didn't say anything. He just looked at me, waiting. And I had this strange moment of hesitation. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I suddenly realized what answering it would do. If I said the truth out loud, the evening would change. For everyone. And for a split second I wondered if I should still stop it. Save them from that moment. Which brings me to the part where I still question myself sometimes. Because I honestly ask myself, right there on the sidewalk, am I about to humiliate my own family? That thought hit harder than the embarrassment of the chair. And for a moment I almost said what Dad wanted. Almost. But something inside me stayed quiet. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just still. So I didn't answer the question. Instead, Daniel spoke. Very politely. Sir, he said to my father, the payment for the venue was processed through our standard reservation contract several months ago. Dad nodded impatiently. Yes, we booked it online. Daniel glanced down at the clipboard. Through the management system, yes. Then he looked back up. And the property owner approved the reservation. That sentence slipped past my parents without landing immediately. But I felt it. Because the next words were the ones that changed everything. Dad frowned. Property owner. Daniel nodded. Yes. My mom looked confused now. What does that have to do with Emma? Daniel hesitated. Not because he was unsure, but because he seemed to realize he was about to reveal something my family didn't know. He looked at me briefly, almost asking permission. I didn't say anything. And that was enough. The venue is privately owned, Daniel said. And Emma is listed as the owner representative. Silence. Real silence this time. Not the awkward kind. The kind where a sentence takes several seconds to fully reach everyone in the conversation. My dad's face changed first. The color drained slowly, like someone had pulled a dimmer switch. What? He said. Daniel stayed calm. The property holding company lists Emma as the primary owner. My mom shook her head. That's not possible. I took a breath and said quietly, I bought the building 2 years ago. The courtyard music kept playing behind the doors. Guests were laughing somewhere inside. The wedding was still happening. But outside, everything had stopped. Dad stared at me, then at the building, then back at me again. And that's when I realized something. For the first time in my life, my family had absolutely no idea what to say to me next. For a few seconds after I said it, nobody moved. Not my mom. Not my dad. Not even Daniel. The music from inside the courtyard kept drifting through the doors, cheerful and completely unaware of what was happening 10 feet away. I bought the building 2 years ago. The words were still hanging there. My dad blinked like he was trying to physically refocus his eyes. That's not funny, he said. I hadn't realized he thought it was a joke until that moment. I'm not joking. My mom looked from me to Daniel. Is this real? Daniel nodded carefully. Yes, The confirmation hit differently than my words had. Because suddenly it wasn't just a strange statement from the quiet daughter sitting outside. It was paperwork, contracts, a building they had already rented. My dad let out a slow breath. You're telling me, he said slowly, that you own this place? Yes. And you never mentioned that. There wasn't anger in his voice yet, just disbelief. I shrugged slightly. It never came up. That answer probably sounded strange to anyone listening. But if you had grown up in my house, you might understand it. Important things about me had a way of drifting past unnoticed. So eventually I stopped announcing them. For a moment nobody spoke. Then my mom said quietly, Emma, why didn't you tell us? That question sat heavier than the others. Because I honestly didn't know how to answer it in a way that didn't sound cruel. I guess, I said slowly, I didn't think it would matter. My dad let out a short laugh. This matters. Daniel cleared his throat gently. Would you like me to continue preparing the reception area? It was such a practical question that it almost broke the tension. Because the truth was, the wedding was still happening. Guests were seated. Dinner service was about to start. And the bride had no idea that her parents and sister were standing outside debating property ownership. Dad ran a hand through his hair. We're not canceling the wedding, he said quickly. No one suggested that, Daniel replied calmly. Another silence. Finally my mom looked at me again. So, what happens now? It wasn't confrontational. It sounded more like someone trying to understand the rules of a game they didn't realize they were playing. I thought about that question for a moment. Then I said something that surprised even me. Nothing. My dad frowned. What do you mean nothing? I mean the wedding continues, I said. Like it was always going to. Daniel nodded once, almost approving. Dad looked like he wasn't sure whether to be relieved or suspicious. You're not going to interfere. The word interfere was interesting. Because technically, if I wanted to, I could have done a lot more than interfere. Contracts give property owners certain powers. But I had never planned to use them. And honestly, I didn't want the wedding ruined. Not for Lily. So I shook my head. No. That seemed to relax him slightly. But the tension didn't disappear. It just shifted. Because now there was something new in the air. Awareness. For the first time in my life, my parents were looking at me like I had an entire life they hadn't been paying attention to. And that realization was uncomfortable for all of us. Then something unexpected happened. Dad looked down at the folding chair beside the wall. The same one he had pointed to earlier. He stared at it for a few seconds. Then quietly picked it up and folded it. He didn't say anything while he did it. Just carried it over to the side of the building and leaned it against the brick. It was such a small action. But somehow it said more than an apology would have. Not forgiveness. Not a big emotional moment. Just recognition that the chair shouldn't be there anymore. When he turned back, his expression had softened slightly. "You should come inside," he said. The sentence sounded awkward in his mouth, like he wasn't used to inviting me somewhere. For a second I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because the moment felt strangely delicate. Like one wrong word might snap something. Finally I nodded. "Okay." Daniel opened the courtyard doors for us. As we stepped inside, the warm glow of the string lights filled the space. Guests were laughing. Servers were setting plates. The wedding looked exactly the way Lily had imagined it. Perfect. And for a brief moment, as we walked toward the reception tables, I caught a glimpse of my sister across the courtyard. She was smiling, talking to friends, completely unaware that outside those doors, the story of her wedding day had almost gone in a very different direction. Part of me wondered if she would ever hear the full version. Another part suspected she might not want to. Because the truth is, even though the evening continued peacefully after that, something between my parents and me had shifted. Not broken, but exposed. There were questions none of us knew how to ask yet, and one of them still lingers even now. Not about the venue, not about the wedding, but about everything that came before it. Because sometimes I still wonder, how many other things about me had they never noticed? The wedding itself actually went pretty smoothly after that, which might sound strange considering what had just happened outside. But weddings have this strange gravity to them. Once the music starts and people sit down with their plates and glasses, the event sort of pulls everyone forward whether they're emotionally ready or not. Lily made her entrance. Everyone stood up. The speeches started. And if anyone noticed the tension between my parents and me, they were polite enough not to mention it. I ended up sitting near the back of the reception area. Not hidden exactly. Just somewhere quiet. Daniel walked past once while the servers were bringing out dinner and gave me a small nod. Nothing dramatic. Just that subtle acknowledgement people share when they both know a strange moment has already happened. My parents moved through the room greeting guests like they always do at events. Smiling. Thanking people for coming. From the outside, the evening probably looked perfect. But every once in a while I would catch my mom glancing toward my table, like she was still trying to recalibrate something in her head. And honestly, I think I was doing the same thing. Because the whole situation had flipped a switch I didn't realize was there. For 22 years, I had quietly accepted a certain role in my family. The background one. The dependable one. The kid who didn't need much attention. And that role had felt so normal that I never stopped to question it. Until that folding chair outside the venue. It's strange how a single moment can suddenly highlight patterns you've lived with your entire life. I kept replaying it in my mind. Not the part where Daniel called me the owner. That part was almost secondary. The moment that stayed with me was earlier. My dad pointing to the chair. "Wait here." 2 simple words. Spoken like they had been spoken 100 times before. And maybe they had. Just in smaller ways. After dinner, Lily finally made her way around the tables greeting people. When she reached me, she looked genuinely happy to see me there. "Emma," she said, hugging me quickly. "I thought you got stuck in traffic." I hesitated. Then I just said, something like that. She laughed and hurried off to the next table before I could explain anything. And honestly, I let her go. Because that night wasn't really about correcting the record. It was her wedding. She deserved to enjoy it without discovering that her sister had almost been turned away from the venue she technically owned. My parents didn't bring it up again during the reception either. But near the end of the night, when most of the guests had started leaving, my mom came over to my table. She sat down across from me slowly. For a few seconds she didn't say anything. Then she sighed. "You should have told us." Her voice wasn't accusing. Just tired. I thought about that for a moment. I guess I thought if it mattered, you would have asked. That answer seemed to land somewhere deep. She nodded slowly. I suppose that's fair. We didn't solve anything in that conversation. No dramatic apologies. No big emotional speeches. Just two people quietly realizing there were parts of each other we hadn't really been paying attention to. And honestly, that felt more real than a perfect resolution. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. Just one line. Thank you for letting the evening continue. I smiled when I read it. Because the truth is, I had never planned to do anything else. Owning the building wasn't about power. It was just a fact. But the moment outside the venue reminded me of something important. Sometimes people only notice your place in the room when the room itself belongs to you. And that's a strange realization. Not empowering exactly. Just clarifying. My relationship with my parents didn't magically transform after that day. Families rarely change overnight. But something subtle shifted. They started asking more questions. Listening a little longer. Like they were realizing there might be more to my life than the quiet role they had assigned me years ago. And me. I stopped shrinking myself quite so much. Not dramatically. Just a little. Which brings me to something I've wondered about ever since that day. Have you ever had a moment where people suddenly saw you differently? Not because you changed overnight, but because they finally noticed something that had been there all along? I'm curious how many people have experienced that. So if you're listening to this, tell me in the comments what moment made people finally see you for who you really were. So that's my story, folks. If it resonated with you, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far Emma's voice travels. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is simply the one no one bothered to understand yet.